The alarm blared at 03:47 in the morning, Helix 9 station time. Commander Elena Vasquez had been awake for 40 minutes, sitting in the dark of her quarters with a cup of black coffee in hand, when the sharp tone cut through the station's artificial silence. She didn't startle. For the past 3 days, her instinct had worked better than any early detection system of the Galactic First Contact Alliance. Something was wrong in Sector 7 Gamma. She simply didn't know what yet. Vasquez was 42 years old, with dark hair pulled back into a practical bun, a thin scar below her left jawline, a memento from a rescue mission on Europa, Jupiter's moon, 13 years prior. She was the highest-ranking human officer on Helix 9, one of 12 advanced stations humanity had built over the last 80 years, each a diplomatic contact point on the edges of explored space. Helix 9 was 340 light-years from Earth, orbiting an amber-colored gas giant nicknamed Mustard by its crew. She set the cup on the counter with deliberate care and tapped the communicator on her wrist. "Vasquez to the bridge. Lieutenant Okafor, tell me what we're seeing." Lieutenant James Okafor's voice came through tense and controlled at the same time, the trademark of the young Nigerian who had graduated top of his class at the London Space Academy. "Commander, we have an anomalous mass signature entering the system via jump point Bravo 11. The signature doesn't match any vessel registered in our databases." And, "Commander..." A 2-second pause that said more than any report. "It's not one signature. It's multiple." Vasquez was already in the corridor, boots in hand. "How many?" "The system is still calculating, but gravitational sensors indicate..." He paused again, and she heard the sound of someone swallowing hard in the background. "They indicate at least 400 large-scale units, possibly more." Elena Vasquez stopped in the middle of the corridor for exactly 1 second. Then she resumed her pace, faster. "Alert the entire crew. Omega-3 protocol, and wake Ambassador Theros. I'll need him on the bridge in 10 minutes. Helix 9 had a crew of 382 humans and 47 allied species members, including 6 Vithani, 14 Solari, and 27 of the silicon-based species called Kreth, who communicated through atmospheric pressure variations and whom humans insisted on affectionately calling talking pebbles, much to the diplomatic protocol's embarrassing irritation. The station was built for exploration and diplomacy, not combat. Its defense systems consisted of medium-range force fields and 3 electromagnetic pulse cannons primarily designed to deflect space debris. Ambassador Kyle Theros was already on the bridge when Vasquez arrived. He was a Solari, 2 meters tall with a copper-colored chitinous exoskeleton, and 2 pairs of compound eyes that captured light spectra invisible to humans. Theros had worked with humanity for 32 years, long enough for him to understand human facial expressions with a precision that unnerved newcomers. He read Vasquez's face before she said a word. "How many ships?" he asked, his voice a vibrating whisper that the universal translator in Vasquez's ear converted into palatable sound. "Still counting." She positioned herself in front of the panoramic observation window. Mustard filled a third of the visual field, its ammonia clouds swirling in silent spirals. For now, Sector 7 Gamma looked empty to the eye. But the holographic displays above the workstations told a different story. Red dots appeared one by one, like flames being lit in sequence in the dark. "Dr. Chen, what are the spectrographic sensors telling us about the vessel's composition?" Dr. Wei Chen lifted her head from her station without taking her eyes off the data. She was 36, a xenotechnology specialist, and had the peculiar habit of muttering equations under her breath when processing difficult information. At that moment, she was visibly muttering. "The external structural metal alloy is none of those we've cataloged. New alloy, very dense, very..." She paused. "Very well shielded, Commander. These shields are... That's serious engineering. Lieutenant Okafor pointed to the central display. They've finished exiting the jump point. The red dots stopped appearing. The count system in the upper corner of the holo display showed the final number. Elena Vasquez read it twice to be sure. 523 ships, each, according to tonnage sensors, equivalent in size to a floating city. Ambassador Theros made a sound that the universal translator categorized as expression of extreme gravity, the Solari equivalent of a human muttering, "God help us," through gritted teeth. Vasquez knew enough Solari biology to know that the pigment of his exoskeleton had shifted 2 spectra toward the ultraviolet, a maximum alarm signal in their physiology. "You know them," Vasquez said. It wasn't a question. Theros took a moment before responding. "I know what they represent. They are Krath-Vor, the Iron Hand in loose translation. They have an empire spanning 42 star systems and have existed for at least 12,000 years. We, the Solari, had a single contact with them 400 years ago." He paused. "We lost 14 colonies in that encounter before negotiating a border they allowed us to keep out of mercy or boredom. We never knew for certain which of the two. And they've never come to this sector before. Never. This sector, until 80 years ago, was considered irrelevant by all major powers, after humanity began building its stations." Theros didn't finish the sentence. Vasquez understood. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy late and loudly, building advanced stations at a speed that disconcerted ancient species, opening trade routes, establishing agreements, appearing in places where no one important had been interested in exploring. To most advanced species, humans were accelerated curiosities, too young, too aggressive in their expansion rate, but technologically inferior to be real threats. To the Krath-Vor, apparently, they were something else. The bridge communicator crackled. "Communications." Lieutenant Park Soo-jin's voice came through with a layer of controlled tension that Vasquez recognized, the voice of someone delivering bad news in professional language. "Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the fleet, on broad-spectrum frequency, covering all sector communication systems. They are not using our standard contact protocol. They're transmitting on all frequencies simultaneously." Translation? The system took 40 seconds to decipher. The message is short. Park Soo-jin read slowly. "Emergent class civilization designated Humanus. You have been assessed. You have been found in unauthorized expansion into strategic corridor territory of the Krath-Vor supremacy. Total surrender and immediate cessation of all construction and exploration activity shall be completed within 72 hours. Non-compliance will result in definitive pacification. This is the only communication we will send." Silence on the bridge. Not empty silence, the heavy, charged silence of people processing the real weight of words. "Definitive pacification," Lieutenant Okafor repeated in a low voice. "Is that what I'm understanding it to be?" "Yes," said Ambassador Theros with the painful serenity of one who knows the Conqueror's vocabulary. "It is exactly what you are understanding." Elena Vasquez stared at the 523 red dots on the holodisplay for a long moment. Then she turned to her crew with an expression none of the station's 47 alien members had seen before on a human. Not panic, not performative heroism, something quieter and, in some way, more unsettling than either. Cold determination. "Park, open a long-range communication channel to Earth Defense Council. Absolute priority." She paused, a calculated beat. "And someone bring me more coffee. We're going to have a long night." The response from Earth arrived in 48 minutes. Vasquez had expected longer. The distance between Helix 9 and Earth was 340 light-years. But emergency communications used the quantum warp relays installed along explored routes. Technology bought from the Solari decades ago and refined by human engineers to a point that even the Solari themselves found slightly disconcerting. Even so, 48 minutes suggested that someone on the other side was waiting, that someone already knew or suspected that something like this could happen. The message did not come in video. It came in encrypted text, maximum military protocol, and was signed by General Marcos Reyes, director of the Planetary Defense Council. Vasquez read it alone, in the briefing room adjacent to the bridge, with the door closed. When she finished, she sat in silence for 90 seconds. Then she returned to the bridge with a composed expression. "Gather the senior staff, Conference Room Alpha, 15 minutes. As her team moved, Vasquez went to the observation window and looked at Mustard. The Krath-Vor fleet had positioned itself in a stationary formation 60,000 kilometers from the station, a respectful enough distance not to constitute an immediate threat, close enough that no one on Helix 9 would forget for a second that it existed. It was a calculated choice, intimidation as architecture. She had studied the Krath-Vor in the preceding 30 minutes, using the archives Ambassador Theros had unlocked from the Solari historical records. What she found was consistent and cold. In each of the 14 systems the Krath-Vor had pacified over the last 2,000 years, the pattern was identical. Ultimatum. Wait. Surrender or destruction. None of the conquered species had attempted to resist after the first third of the deadline, because rational data analysis always led to the same conclusion. Resistance was mathematically unviable. The Krath-Vor had learned to use logic as a weapon. The problem, Vasquez thought as the coffee steam rose in slow spirals, was that humanity had a historically complicated relationship with logic. Conference Room Alpha had a capacity for 20 people. 10 were present. Vasquez herself, Lieutenant Okafor, Dr. Wei Chen, Chief Engineer Dmitry Volkov, Lieutenant Park Soo-jin, Doctor of Xenobiology Amara Diallo, 2 senior technicians whose names Vasquez knew by heart out of preference, Ambassador Theros, and, unexpectedly, Grek, the eldest of the Kreth present on the station, whom humans called Wise Pebble when they thought he wasn't listening, which was impossible, because the Kreth detected atmospheric pressure variations at distances that made acoustic privacy a rather optimistic human concept. "I'll get straight to the point," Vasquez said. "The Defense Council knows the situation. The official response is that Earth will not yield to the ultimatum. It's not heroism. It's galactic geopolitical calculation. If we yield here, we send a signal to every military power in the galaxy that humanity can be bent with enough pressure. The Council estimates we would have 3 years before 6 other factions tested the same logic in other sectors." The silence that followed was the thoughtful kind. Okafor broke it first. "So we're being used as a proof of concept." "All of us are, eventually." Vasquez placed the tablet with the report on the table. "The operational question is this. We have 68 hours and 40 minutes remaining. Earth is mobilizing, but any reinforcements will take at least 120 hours to arrive, even via the fastest jump point. This means that when the deadline expires, we will be alone. With 382 humans and 47 allies," said Dr. Diallo, "against a fleet of over 500 ships." "That's correct." Engineer Volkov, who had been silent until then with his arms crossed and an expression his colleagues recognized as a sign that he was calculating things in his own brain, lifted his head. Dmitry Volkov was 55, with short white hair, hands that told stories of 30 years fixing things that shouldn't be fixable. He was the son of engineers, the grandson of engineers, and had a deep, almost religious conviction that any problem with mass, volume, and temperature had a solution if you found the right angle. "They're shields," he said. "Chen, you mentioned they're sophisticated." "Extraordinary," she confirmed. "Based on directional energy dissipation. Any energy weapon, plasma, particle beam, high-power laser, would be absorbed and redirected by the fields. It's like trying to cut water with a light knife." She paused. For species that reached space with advanced energy technology, these shields would be impassable. For species that reached space with advanced energy technology, Volkov repeated, slowly, chewing on each word. We didn't reach space with advanced technology. We reached space with fire. Theros tilted his head slightly, a gesture Vasquez had learned to recognize as the Solari equivalent of a raised eyebrow. What is the engineer suggesting? I'm suggesting there's a fundamental difference between what the Krathvor expect us to shoot at them and what we can actually shoot at them. Volkov stood and walked to the holographic projection panel. Dr. Chen, can you show me the spectral analysis of their hull material? As Chen transferred the data, Vasquez observed the face of each person in the room. Okafor was absorbing, processing. He was good at it. The kind of mind that reserved judgment until it had sufficient data. Park was clearly afraid, but her fear was functional. The kind that sharpens the senses instead of paralyzing them. Diallo had opened her own tablet and was cross-referencing Chen's analyses with xenobiology files. Vasquez didn't yet know where that would lead, but she knew Amara Diallo well enough to know she didn't cross-reference data randomly. And Grek, the Kreth, remained as still as ever. A 2-meter cylinder of silicon organic material with a surface textured like polished granite. No visible eyes, but hundreds of pressure receptors distributed across his skin that mapped the environment with a resolution that put any human sonar to shame. When the Kreth communicated, they did so via pressure impulses that the station's universal translator picked up with difficulty. The Kreth language had been developed on a planet with a thick atmosphere where sound traveled in ways human language engineers described as functionally impossible to replicate. What Grek emitted at that moment, the translator converted as, "The correct question has not yet been asked." "Which question?" Vasquez asked. Grek took a moment. The Kreth were never in a hurry, a characteristic that tested any human's patience, but which Vasquez had learned to respect as a sign that the answer would be substantive. "You are asking how to survive. The more useful question is, what do the Krathvor not know about you?" The silence this time was of another kind. Not heavy, electric. Dr. Diallo looked up from her tablet with an expression Vasquez had seen before on scientists, when a piece of information unexpectedly fits into a larger puzzle. "I can answer that, at least partially. I've spent the last 40 minutes reading everything the Solari archives have on the Krathvor and their previous conquest campaigns." She turned the tablet so everyone could see the data series. In every documented conquest, the Krathvor faced species that arrived at space warfare in the same way. Evolution in stable environments, technology developed linearly and gradually, minimal internal conflict, species that discovered space in relative peace and explored it as a natural extension of that peace. "And humans didn't," said Okafor. "Humans were never in relative peace," Diallo said with a precision that was not arrogant. It was simply diagnostic. "We have records of continuous conflict over the last 10,000 years of documented history. Our military technologies and our civilian technologies developed in parallel and fed each other in ways none of the species the Krathvor encountered before could have produced. Mass propulsion was originally artillery technology. Our best detection systems came from wartime radar. The communication network we use for scientific discoveries was originally designed for defense coordination. The Krathvor assessed our surface technology," Vasquez said, starting to see where Diallo was going. "What they classified as early space age. They saw the engines, the stations, the standard force fields," Diallo confirmed. "What they didn't see, what no outsider can easily see, is the depth of our conflict engineering legacy. The quantity of solutions for applied physics problems in adverse conditions that we have accumulated over millennia of trying to kill each other in increasingly creative ways." Volkov smiled. It was a small but genuine smile. "So the question is, How do we translate that legacy into something that works against them in the next 68 hours? 67 hours and 52 minutes? Park automatically corrected, looking at the timer on the wall, and then felt slightly embarrassed for having interrupted. Vasquez gave her a discreet nod that told her it was correct to do so. Vasquez stood. Volkov, you and Chen have authorization to use any technical resource on the station. I want a complete analysis of structural vulnerabilities of the enemy hulls based on spectral data in no more than 6 hours. Diallo, continue mining the Solari archives. Any information on Krathvor tactical behavior, documented or undocumented weaknesses, internal communication protocols if they exist. Okafor, coordinate with the station's defense engineering teams and give me a complete inventory of everything we have. And I mean everything, including systems not designed as weaponry, but that could function as such. She looked at Theros. Ambassador, I need you to contact all allied representatives we have in the sector. Not to ask for military aid. We don't have time for that, and honestly, I don't know if they would come. But information about the Krathvor has value, and any fragment they can provide us could be the difference. Finally, she looked at Grek. The Kreth had remained motionless throughout the meeting. Pressure receptors absorbing every air variation in the room with an attention that humans rarely manage to maintain for so long. And you, Grek? The Kreth emitted a sequence that the translator processed for 3 seconds before converting. I will observe. The Kreth have existed longer than the Krathvor. There are things we have observed about them that we never documented because there was no need. Now there is a need. Vasquez nodded. Then let's get to work. 67 hours. The universe is watching to see what humanity does when it has no easy choice. Let's give it a response worth watching. The team dispersed with the characteristic efficiency of people who understand that time is the only currency that matters at that moment. Vasquez remained in the room for an instant, alone with the holograms of the Krathvor fleet projected above the table. 523 points of cold light, each representing technology from 12,000 years of military history. She thought of Reyes, on Earth, waiting. She thought of the 8 billion people who still didn't know what was happening 340 light-years away. She thought of the archivist who, according to Solari records, had tried to warn the Galactic Council about something in humans that surface data didn't capture. Then she turned off the holograms, picked up her coffee cup, and returned to the bridge. There was work to do. 18 hours into the crisis, engineer Dmitry Volkov hadn't slept. Hadn't eaten anything beyond 3 protein bars someone had left beside his workstation, and had consumed an amount of coffee that would have hospitalized any of the 6 Vithani on the station whose nervous systems processed caffeine as a Category 2 neurotoxin. This was, in itself, a xenobiological data point the Krathvor did not possess. Dr. Amara Diallo had documented the fact 2 hours earlier when one of the Vithani, a slender, blue-gray-skinned creature named Vel, who served as a research assistant on the station, had entered Volkov's lab with a second cup of coffee for the engineer and involuntarily recoiled 3 steps upon smelling the aroma. The universal translator had converted Vel's subsequent vocalization as, "How are you still standing?" To which Volkov had replied, without taking his eyes off the data, "Habit." Diallo had noted the exchange in her field journal with the automatic precision of one who never turns off scientific mode, even in crisis. Then she had returned to the Solari archives with a new idea forming at the edges of her thought, still not sufficiently shaped to be called a hypothesis. Volkov's report reached the bridge at 21:33. Vasquez read it in silence, standing, while Okafor waited beside her. When she finished, she passed the tablet to the lieutenant without comment. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. This is absurdly simple," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't disappointment. It was the specific surprise of one who expects an elaborate trick and receives a direct punch. "The best solutions usually are," said Vasquez, Call Volkov, Chen, and Diallo to the bridge, and Grek, if he wishes to come. I want his point of view before we decide anything." Volkov arrived with his hair more disheveled than anyone had ever seen, carrying a portable holographic model that he projected onto the bridge table without ceremony. The image that appeared was a cross-section of a Krath-Vor ship rendered from Chen's spectral data, an onion of dense metal alloy layers around a propulsion core that sensors identified as antimatter confined by a magnetic field. "Right," said Volkov, with the intonation of someone presenting a plumbing solution rather than a space battle plan. "The fundamental problem with their shields is that they are magnificently sophisticated, and magnificently sophisticated means magnificently specialized. Their energy dissipation fields work by converting energetic impact into heat distributed across the hull. Laser, plasma, particle beam. All of that arrives as energy, is absorbed, is redistributed. The hull heats up marginally, and they move on." "But," said Dr. Chen, pointing to the outer layer of the model, "energy isn't the only way to transfer force." "Momentum," said Okafor slowly. "Momentum," Volkov confirmed with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student arrived at the correct answer. "An object with sufficient mass traveling at sufficient velocity doesn't transfer energy. It transfers momentum. The physics are different. Their shields have no mechanism for momentum dissipation because no species with advanced weaponry technology uses physical projectiles. Why would they? It's inefficient, primitive, requires mass that could be used for other things." He paused. "Unless you're a species that spent millennia shooting things at other things before discovering force fields." Vasquez looked at the model. "What do we have available in terms of mass launch capability?" This is where it gets interesting. Volkov expanded the model to include a schematic of Helix 9 itself. The station has 3 emergency supply launch systems, hollow projectiles used to deliver cargo to ships that cannot dock. Short range, low speed, useless as weaponry. He touched 3 points on the schematic. But we also have the debris propulsion systems installed on all advanced stations to clear the orbital field of industrial waste. These are essentially low-power electromagnetic cannons designed to push metallic fragments into decay orbits, with adequate modification of the field profiles and redirection of the main reactor's particle accelerators as an additional energy source. He spread his hands in a gesture any engineer would recognize as mathematically viable, operationally insane. "How long to modify?" Vasquez asked. "With the full engineering team working in shifts? 36 hours? "We have 49 hours and a few minutes remaining," Park said from her station, unprompted. "Then we have a margin," said Volkov. "Narrow, but it exists." Vasquez turned to Dr. Diallo. "You said you had something else. I saw your expression when Volkov finished speaking." Diallo nodded, organizing her data on the tablet. Amara Diallo was 38, born in Nairobi, a doctoral candidate in comparative xenobiology at the University of Oxford, specializing in the cognition and behavior of non-carbon-based species. She had chosen a career most of her childhood peers had considered exotic to the point of impracticality, and had spent the last 12 years being systematically proven right by a universe that turned out to be far more populous than any previous generation had imagined. The Solari archives on the Krath-Vor include behavioral records of their previous campaigns, she said. Most were dismissed by Solari historians as simple documentation of conquest. But when you read them through a behavioral analysis lens, a pattern emerges that is relevant to what we are planning. She projected a series of historical records onto the holo display. In every documented conquest, the Krath-Vor never modified their operational plan during execution. Never. They develop a strategy based on the initial assessment of the adversary, and then execute it to the end, regardless of emergent variables. "Tactical inflexibility," said Okafor. "Not exactly." Diallo chose her words carefully. "It's more subtle than that. The Krathvor cognitive structure, from what the Solari records describe, is deeply hierarchical and based on predictive models. They are extraordinarily good at anticipating behaviors within the parameters they know. When a species acts within expectations, the Krathvor respond with efficiency bordering on perfection. She paused. But the records show something consistent in moments when a species acted outside the predicted model, even in small things. There are reports of decision paralysis in the Krathvor command, delays, coordination errors that would never occur under normal conditions. They get confused, Vasquez said. They get recalculating, and recalculating costs time. In combat, time is everything. Diallo looked at the commander. What I'm saying is that Volkov's strategy for the shields is necessary, but not sufficient. Even if we manage to damage ships with physical projectiles, 523 ships are still 523 ships. We won't win by sheer attack force. But if we can make them lose command cohesion, if we force them to process variables that are not in their models, we can create windows of opportunity that an enemy operating within normal parameters would never give us. You're describing psychological warfare, said Volkov. I'm describing what humans do naturally when pressured, said Diallo. Improvisation, unpredictability, the ability to make functional decisions in contexts for which we haven't been specifically trained. She looked around the room. The Krathvor have never faced this before. None of the species they conquered were like this. Grek emitted a long sequence that the translator took 5 seconds to process. When the conversion came, it was, the xenobiologist describes what the Kreth have observed in humans since first contact. You solve problems in ways that violate expectation because you do not possess the expectation. It is disconcerting. It is also, I now recognize, extraordinarily useful in certain circumstances. There was something in the phrasing, the addition of I now recognize, that Vasquez registered as significant. The Kreth did not modify statements retrospectively out of modesty. They did so when they genuinely changed position based on new evidence. Grek was, in his silicon way, saying he had underestimated something. Grek, Vasquez said, you mentioned that the Kreth observed things about the Krathvor that they never documented. It is time to share. The Kreth remained motionless for a moment that, in any human, would have been dramatic. In Grek, it was simply the time it took to organize millennia of observational memory into a communicable form for carbon-based creatures with a century-long life expectancy. The Krathvor have an intership communication system based on entangled quantum frequencies. It is what allows their fleet's cohesion, real-time coordination without propagation delay. No species they have encountered has ever discovered how to interfere with this system because it requires an understanding of the quantum entanglement structure that... The translator paused, processing. That is not intuitive for short-lived organisms. But you understand, said Chen, and her voice had the sharp tension of someone who sees an equation suddenly resolve itself. The Kreth have existed long enough to observe patterns that short-lived organisms do not live long enough to perceive, said Grek. Yes, we understand the structure, and there is a specific resonance frequency in the low-energy microwave spectrum that, if transmitted in the correct pattern, produces destructive interference in their quantum entanglement. Not permanent, temporary, but sufficient to blind the fleet's coordinated communication for a measurable period. The room became absolutely quiet. For how long? Vasquez asked. Based on Kreth observations, said Grek, I estimate between 8 and 15 minutes before auxiliary systems compensate. 8 minutes of a fleet of 500 ships operating without central coordination, Okafor said in a low voice, as if thinking aloud, while physical projectiles pass through shields designed only for energy. Volkov made the sound that Russians make when something mathematically improbable begins to seem mathematically possible. It wasn't a word. It was a slow, controlled exhale that said more than any analysis. Vasquez looked at each face in the room. at Volkov with his chaotic hair and the quiet certainty of an engineer who had found the right angle, at Chen with her eyes gleaming with data, at Diallo with the careful restraint of a scientist who doesn't want to celebrate hypotheses before testing them, at Okafor, processing, calculating, arriving at the same conclusions via the logical route, at Park, who was clearly afraid but wrote notes with a speed that indicated fear had converted into fuel, at Grek, immobile and immense and ancient, who had guarded knowledge for reasons the Kreth never needed to articulate and now delivered it with the naturalness of one who finally finds the right moment for a piece of information he had carried for a long time. 382 humans, 47 allies, a station built for diplomacy, 49 hours. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. "Very well," said Commander Elena Vasquez. "We're going to build something the Krathvor never predicted encountering, a response they have no model to process." She looked at Volkov. "Start modifications now. I want the launch systems operational in 30 hours, not 36. Bring in whoever you need. Sleep when you can." She looked at Grek. "I'll need you to work with Chen to calibrate the station's microwave transmitters. Is that possible?" "It is possible," said Grek. And then, in an addition that the translator took 2 seconds to convert and that no one in the room had expected, "It will be interesting." None of the humans present had heard a Kreth use the word interesting before. There was no cataloging of the concept in the station's xenolinguistics records. Vasquez decided it was a good sign. There were exactly 48 hours and 22 minutes remaining when Helix 9 began, silently and with all the urgency of a species that had learned to transform adversity into ingenuity over 10,000 years of constant practice, to prepare to do something no one in the known universe expected it could do: fight back. Helix 9 had never sounded like this. Not the alarm. That had been silenced hours ago, replaced by the crisis operation protocol, which kept amber lights pulsing in the corridors every 40 seconds as a constant but not hysterical reminder that the state of emergency remained active. The sound that took over the station was another. The sound of urgent work. Molecular cutting saws opening access panels untouched for years. Pressure hammers recalibrating structural supports. The specific hiss of electromagnetic accelerators being tested in increasing power sequences. Each test leaving a residual hum in the metal walls that the most experienced technicians learn to interpret as a signature of system health. And beneath it all, constant and almost meditative, the voice of engineer Dmitry Volkov coordinating everything. He didn't shout. He had never been the type. He moved through the engineering compartments with a cup of coffee in one hand and a diagnostic tablet in the other, stopping at each workstation long enough to assess, instruct, and move on, leaving behind technicians who worked with the specific concentration of one who has received clear direction from someone who knows exactly what they are doing. It was leadership by competence, not by authority, the kind Vasquez had recognized in him during the crew selection process 8 years prior, and which was impossible to artificially manufacture. The biggest obstacle wasn't technical, it was physical. The station's 3 debris propulsion systems were installed on the outer layer of Helix 9's equatorial ring, designed to fire towards the orbital debris field below the station. Redirecting them to cover the Krathvor fleet's approach vectors required disassembling and reassembling the support mounts of each system, a job that under normal conditions would take a team of 40 people 5 days. Volkov had divided the available teams into groups of 8, assigned each group to a system, and then done something that surprised even veteran technicians. He had distributed the modification plans in an open format, inviting any crew member with relevant knowledge to suggest optimizations. 37 people responded, including the station's senior cook, a woman named Beatrice Salazar, who had studied mechanical engineering for 2 years before changing her course, and who identified a solution to the torque problem in the rotating supports that saved 4 hours of work. Volkov had incorporated the suggestion without hesitation and sent Salazar a 6-word thank you message that she saved to her personal system. Meanwhile, in the station's communications lab, Dr. Wei Chen and Grek worked in almost perfect silence. It was an unlikely visual partnership. Chen, 5 feet 4 inches tall, moving quickly between equipment, black hair loose for the first time since Vasquez had known her because there was no time to carefully tie it back. And Grek, 2 meters of silicon organic material motionless in the center of the room, looking like a forgotten sculpture in a lab, except that his instructions arrived in pressure pulses that Chen had learned to interpret in real time without the universal translator. Faster, more precise for the work they were doing. The problem was one of extraordinarily fine calibration. The resonance frequency Grek described did not exist in any human database because no human had had reason to look for it. It was a very low-energy microwave frequency in a range that the station's equipment could generate, but had never been calibrated to produce with the precision necessary for quantum interference. It was like trying to tune a musical instrument to a note not on any known scale, using equipment designed for another purpose. Chen had reformulated the problem 3 times in the first 2 hours. In the 4th formulation, she had arrived at an approach that used the station's long-range communication transmitters in parallel, each contributing a fraction of the total frequency, the sum creating the necessary pattern without requiring any individual transmitter to operate outside its design specifications. Grek had remained motionless for 45 seconds after Chen presented the solution. Then he emitted a pressure pulse that the translator converted as, "The human species solves problems laterally with a frequency the Kreth consider statistically anomalous." Chen had looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," said Grek. Then a pause. "And yes, on the bridge." Vasquez coordinated the multiple work streams with a distributed attention that was perhaps her rarest skill, the ability to keep 6 different problems in simultaneous states of monitoring without letting any of them drop below the critical attention threshold. It was a skill she had developed not at the Space Academy but much earlier, as the eldest of 4 siblings in a family from Chicago where resources were always slightly insufficient and demands always slightly excessive. Ambassador Theros had returned from his communications with Allied representatives in the sector at 14:00 on the 2nd day with mixed information. 3 species, the Vithani, the Loru, and a collective of gaseous organisms called the N, that humanity had encountered only twice before, had transmitted tactical data on the Krathvor from their own historical observations. None dramatically new, but each fragment potentially useful. None had offered direct assistance. Theros had reported this without visible judgment. But Vasquez had learned to read the specific angle of his antennae when he was withholding an opinion on others' behavior. "They are afraid," she said, not as an accusation. "Fear informed by history," said Theros. "The Krathvor have long memories and administer grudges with a consistency that makes them enduring adversaries for anyone who opposes them. The species that do not help humanity now are calculating that it is safer to await the outcome and then align with the victor." "It's rational." "It's rational," Theros confirmed. "And it is, I can say with some knowledge, fundamentally different from how humans make decisions in comparable situations." Vasquez had stared at him. "What do you mean?" Theros took a moment, and when he spoke, there was something in the vibrating modulation of his voice that the translator categorized as reflective candor, a mode Vasquez had rarely encountered in her decades-long career dealing with Solari. "I have worked with humans for 32 years, Commander. I have observed you in situations of crisis, negotiation, discovery. There is a pattern that no analysis I have conducted has been able to reduce to a simple mechanism. Humans frequently assist entities with whom they have no predictable mutual benefit relationship. They often put themselves at risk for others without calculating a return, And they do so with such naturalness that they seem not to register it as remarkable behavior. He tilted his head slightly. The other Allied representatives did not come because they calculated it was not profitable. None of them considered coming simply because it is the right thing to do, except perhaps Greg. Vasquez processed that. Are the Kreth altruistic? The Kreth are ancient enough to have arrived at the conclusion, through their own and probably very different means than humans, that certain behaviors have value independent of immediate return. Theros did the Solari equivalent of a shrug. You arrive at the same conclusion by instinct. It is fascinating and, at this specific moment, extremely relevant. The conversation had stayed with Vasquez as she monitored progress. At 22:00 on the second day, Volkov reported that the first modified debris propulsion system had successfully completed calibration tests. The effective range after modification was 80,000 kilometers, enough to reach the Krath-Vor formation with margin. The exit velocity of the tungsten projectiles hastily machined by the station's fabrication team was 200 meters per second, which in terms of momentum transferred per impact produced numbers Volkov had presented with the expression of someone who had checked the calculations 4 times because he didn't want to be responsible for an error in an optimistic direction. The numbers were correct in all 4 checks. At 03:00 on the third day, 18 hours before the deadline, there was a development no one had anticipated. Park Soo-jin, who had spent the last 2 days monitoring all Krath-Vor fleet communication frequencies in the hope of identifying tactical patterns, signaled Vasquez with the specific urgency of someone who had found something they didn't quite know how to classify. When Vasquez arrived at the communication station, Park had isolated a transmission that differed from the others in structure, rhythm, and repetition frequency. It's not tactical communication, said Park. It's too repetitive to be tactical. The same basic pattern transmitted at regular 42-minute intervals. She looked at Vasquez. It's routine internal communication. Specifically, from what I can decode with fragments from the Solari archives, it's a crew status protocol. System health check for each ship. Vasquez stared at the screen for a moment. They're doing routine check-ins. Every 42 minutes, with a precision of plus or minus 3 seconds of variation. Park paused. Commander, they are so certain there's no threat that they continue operating routine peace protocols. They haven't switched to combat configuration. Vasquez felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was the cold recognition that the enemy's arrogance was as real a resource as the tungsten in the launch chambers. When is the next check-in? Park checked. In 38 minutes. And the next one? 42 minutes later. Vasquez was quiet for 10 seconds, rearranging pieces on the mental board. Then, Volkov, how long until the second launch system is operational? Volkov's voice came through the communicator slightly muffled, the sound of someone speaking from inside a cramped access compartment. 8 hours. Maybe 7 if Salazar lends me 2 more members of her team. She will lend them. Chen, what's the status of the transmitter calibration? Chen's response came with the background hum of the transmitters in test mode. 70%. We need 4 more hours to achieve the precision Greg specified. Do it in 3. Whatever you need, say it now. A pause. 2 more pairs of hands. And more coffee. Both on the way. Vasquez turned to Okafor. Lieutenant, I want a full battlefield simulation model set up and running in the next 2 hours. When Volkov and Chen are done, we will rehearse the attack sequence until every team member can execute it with their eyes closed. And the Krath-Vor deadline? Okafor asked. If System 2 is ready in 7 hours and transmitter calibration in 3, we still have a 10-hour window before the ultimatum expires. We're not waiting for the deadline, said Vasquez. Okafor looked up. Commander, the deadline is theirs. It's their time on their terms designed to maximize psychological pressure on us while they operate unhurriedly in routine mode. She looked at the red dots on the holo display, 523 points of light that at this moment were performing system health check-ins as if there were no threat in the universe warranting greater concern. When we are ready, we attack. On our terms. In our time. She paused. Let them discover what it means to face a species that doesn't follow the script you wrote for it. James Okafor looked at his commander for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, with the demeanor of someone recalibrating an assessment they thought complete. He turned to his station and began setting up the simulation. In the Krath-Vor fleet, the routine check-in at Aero 342 occurred with 2 seconds of variation precision. All 523 ships reported nominal status. Supreme Admiral Dreth Kai, a title that in Krath-Vor literally translated as he whose will shapes space, received the consolidated report in his command chamber and filed it without reading it completely. There was nothing to read. It was routine. It was as it had always been. In 16 hours, humans would surrender or be pacified, and the sector would be added to the Supremacy's list of administered territories. There was even a provisional regional administrator designation already chosen. The bureaucracy of conquest had learned to work with efficiency. Dreth Kai closed the report and went to sleep. Helix 9, 60,000 kilometers away, did not sleep. It had never stopped. And in 14 hours and 11 minutes, the universe would discover what happens when a species that has spent millennia learning to survive the impossible decides it's time to prove it learned the lesson well. The final rehearsal ended at 11:17 on the third day. Each team member had executed their part of the sequence 6 times in the simulator. Not because Vasquez doubted their competence, but because there was a demonstrable neurophysiological difference between knowing what to do and having the procedure etched into the nervous system to the point of being executable under pressure without consulting conscious memory. She had learned this in the most concrete way possible 13 years ago on Europa, when an infrastructure collapse had left her rescue team with 40 seconds to make a decision that the manual said required 2 minutes of evaluation. They had survived because they had rehearsed enough for the body to take over when the brain was still processing panic. 6 executions, then a 7th at Volkov's insistence, who had identified a 0. 4-second window in the transition between the activation of the interference transmitters and the start of the first launch cycle, where a coordination failure could compromise both systems simultaneously. The 7th execution had eliminated the window. Volkov had declared the rehearsal concluded with the minimalist satisfaction of an engineer who had found and closed the last gap. At 11:43, Vasquez gathered the entire station crew in the main hangar. 382 humans and 47 allied members arranged in an informal semicircle around a raised platform that normally served for visitor ship arrival briefings. She had asked everyone to come, not just the operational team, but the maintenance technicians, atmospheric science specialists, medical team, logistics personnel, the cooks. Beatriz Salazar was in the 3rd row with her arms crossed, and an expression Vasquez recognized as that of someone who had decided they would face whatever came next. Vasquez didn't use the microphone. The hangar was large, but the acoustics were sufficient, and she had discovered over the years that there is a qualitative difference between an amplified voice and a voice that simply projects. The first informs, the second connects. "I'll be direct," she said, and the hangar fell silent with the swiftness of a space where everyone was already paying attention. Within approximately 2 hours, Helix 9 will initiate an action no diplomatic class station has ever executed in the history of human presence in space. We will strike first. We will use systems designed to collect orbital debris and communication transformers as weaponry, and we will do this because it is the only option our analysis indicates has a reasonable probability of success. She paused. I won't lie to you by saying reasonable means certain. It means it's better than the alternatives we evaluated, and we evaluated all alternatives carefully. Silence. Not the tense silence of paralyzing fear, the concentrated silence of people processing information with seriousness. What I need from every person in this hangar is simple. Do the job you know how to do, when it's needed, without hesitation. Not because I order you to, but because it's exactly what each of you was selected to do, and because this station, this crew, and this mission matter, not just to us, but to every species watching this sector now, calculating whether it's worth fighting for something when the alternative is easier. She let the sentence settle. We're going to show them the correct calculation. There was no speech after that. No heroic applause. People simply began moving back to their stations with the quiet purpose of those who have work to do. It was, in a way, the most human possible response to a battle speech. Not exultation, but immediate action. Ambassador Theros, who had watched everything from the side of the hangar, emitted a sequence that the translator converted as remarkable, and then remained quiet for the rest of the way back to the bridge. At 1329, all systems were green. Vasquez stood on the bridge, looking at the holo display where the 523 red dots remained in stationary formation, serene and unaltered, completely oblivious to the fact that the equation had changed overnight. The next routine Krath 4 fleet check-in was scheduled for 1354, 25 minutes away. She had chosen the moment with precision. They would attack 6 minutes before the check-in, when the fleet's internal communication systems would be at peak activity preparing for the routine protocol, trafficking status data between ships in volumes that would maximize the quantum interference window. Transmitter status, she said. All 11 transmitters in interference configuration, frequency calibrated, awaiting activation. Chen's voice came through the communicator with a stability Vasquez knew had cost effort. Launch system status. System 1. Operational. Loaded. Locked onto primary vector. Volkov. System 2. Operational. Loaded. Locked onto secondary vector. 142 tungsten projectiles available for continuous fire cycles. Reload time between cycles, 4 seconds. Okafor, trajectory confirmation. Ballistic trajectories calculated for primary and secondary vectors. Flight time to the fleet's central formation at current exit velocity, 19 seconds. A pause. Commander, I want to record that the calculations have been independently verified 3 times by myself, Dr. Chen, and the station's navigation system. There is full convergence. Noted. Park, communications, monitoring all Krathvor frequencies. No pattern change detected, they don't know. Park's voice had a slightly incredulous quality, as if part of her still expected the universe to be more attentive. Grek. The Kreth was positioned adjacent to the communications station, his silicon surface in direct contact with the transmitters via a physical connection Chen had specifically configured. The Kreth could modulate frequencies through their own structure with a precision no station software could fully replicate. It was Grek who would execute the actual interference activation, at the exact timing he had specified based on millennia of observing quantum patterns that humans were still learning to describe mathematically. The Kreth emitted a single pressure pulse. The translator converted. Ready. Vasquez looked at the timer. 13:43. 11 minutes. She thought for a fleeting moment of Earth, of the quiet enormity of 8 billion people who existed completely oblivious to what was about to happen 340 light-years away, of the engineers who had built Helix 9 without imagining it would one day be a turning point in galactic history, of the scientists who developed the long-range transmitters without knowing they would one day be reconfigured as a quantum interference weapon, of the entire chain of accidental invention and creative necessity that had produced, over centuries, exactly the set of tools needed for that specific moment. Then she stopped thinking about it, because there was work to do. "Internal countdown," she said. "Interference activation at T-minus 10 minutes. Launch at T-minus 9 minutes and 42 seconds. All systems confirm green status in the next 2 minutes." Confirmations arrived in sequence. Green, 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 green. In the last 3 minutes before activation, the bridge became very quiet. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who have said everything there was to say and are now simply present in the moment, with full attention, in the way humans only can when they know it truly matters. Vasquez simply said, "Grek, now." What happened in the following seconds was invisible to the human eye and undetectable without specific instrumentation. Helix 9's 11 communication transmitters simultaneously emitted a very low-energy microwave pattern at a frequency no human electromagnetic radiation database had catalogued before. The emission lasted exactly 3 seconds. In terms of power, it was less energy than a portable personal communication system. But the frequency was exact, the pattern was precise, and quantum physics doesn't negotiate. 60,000 kilometers away, in 523 ships simultaneously, the quantum entanglement communication systems that coordinated every Krathvor fleet movement with millisecond precision entered interference collapse. Not a catastrophic failure, a sudden and complete degradation of quantum coherence. As if someone had erased the common language through which the fleet thought as a single organism, and left 523 individual entities with no way to coordinate in real time. On the bridge's communication displays, Park watched something she had never seen in 3 years of monitoring alien communication patterns. The Krathvor frequencies exploded into cacophony. Hundreds of simultaneous transmissions, without coordination, without protocol, the communicational equivalent of a room where everyone starts speaking at once in different languages. "Interference confirmed," she said, and there was in her voice the tension of one checking if a theoretical calculation works in reality. "Fleet coherence, compromised. Estimated window 8 to 12 minutes. Launch," said Vasquez. Helix 9's 2 modified debris propulsion systems fired with a sound that reverberated through the entire station's structure. Not an explosion, but a deep, resonant impact of electromagnetic accelerators operating at maximum load, followed by the sharp hiss of metal accelerating through a confined field. The tungsten projectiles exited the station at a speed of 200 meters per second. Invisible against the star field, with no energetic signature that any radiation-based detection system could identify as a threat. 19 seconds. In the command chamber of the flagship, Drethkai had been awakened by the collapse of the quantum communication systems with the urgency of an alarm. He, in his 42 years of military career, had never truly heard sound. He was on his feet, still processing, when the first impacts registered. There was no form in Drethkai's model for what the sensors reported. Physical projectiles, solid mass on a ballistic trajectory, no active propulsion, no energy signature. The fleet's threat sensors, calibrated to detect energy, plasma, and high-frequency radiation weaponry, simply had no response protocol for solid metal traveling at hypersonic speed because no species the supremacy had encountered in the last 12,000 years had used physical projectiles as primary weaponry. It was prehistory technology. It was what species did before discovering energy fields. It was completely, absolutely, categorically outside the model. The Krathvor ship's energy dissipation shields, designed with a sophistication representing the apex of 12,000 years of military technological development, did exactly what they were designed to do. They absorbed and redistributed impact energy as heat distributed across the hull. The problem was that tungsten projectiles at 200 meters per second don't deliver energy. They deliver momentum, pure Newtonian force, without an electromagnetic signature, without initial heat, without anything the dissipation system had any mechanism to process. The force field simply did not react. The projectiles passed through the shields as if they didn't exist and impacted the hulls with the simple, non-negotiable physics of mass times velocity squared. The first launch sequence hit 17 ships in the central formation. The Krathvor's dense alloy hulls were extraordinarily resilient. No ship was destroyed in the first cycle. But the structural integrity sensors of each registered real, measurable damage to systems that hadn't been damaged in combat for centuries. The propulsion systems of 3 ships were compromised. The force field generators of 2 others entered automatic protection mode, reducing coverage by 40% while redistributing energy for repairs, and the fleet, without coordinated quantum communication, couldn't collectively process what was happening. Each ship saw its own data. None could aggregate the complete picture. What should have been a single military organism of 523 coordinated parts was, at that moment, 523 separate entities trying to individually understand something that only made sense when viewed as a whole. Drethkai shouted orders that reached adjacent ships with the delay of backup communication systems operating on conventional frequencies, slow, without quantum encryption, completely inadequate for coordinating a fleet of that scale in real time. He ordered the shields reconfigured for physical coverage instead of energy dissipation, but reconfiguration took time and required engineering coordination that, without the quantum system, had to be executed ship by ship. The second launch cycle left Helix 9 4 seconds after the first. Interference window, 6 minutes remaining, Park reported. They are attempting to re-establish communication on alternative frequencies, fragmented but growing. Third cycle, said Vasquez. Loaded, said Volkov. Firing. The third cycle had been calculated for a different vector, not the central formation, but the fleet's left flank, where sensors identified 3 ships whose shield integrity had already been compromised by previous sequences. The projectiles hit hulls that had already absorbed structural impacts and whose defense systems were in the process of recalibration, the worst possible moment to receive a third impact. 2 ships on the left flank completely lost propulsion. A third entered uncontrolled rotation, its guidance systems compromised, drifting out of formation. On Helix 9's bridge, no one celebrated. Everyone was working. Interference window, 3 minutes, said Park. Quantum coherence is reconstituting. In 2 minutes and 40 seconds, they will have partial coordination back. Fourth cycle, said Vasquez. Loaded, firing. After the 4th cycle, we cease launching and await, said Vasquez. We are not trying to destroy the fleet. We are trying to make Drethkai make a decision. Okafor understood immediately. You want him to process what happened. I want him to process what happened and understand that it can happen again, and that each time it happens, we will have variations he didn't foresee. She looked at the holo display, where the red dots had begun to move, not in a coherent attack formation, but in uncoordinated individual movements that were, in tactical terms, worse than standing still. A general with 12,000 years of undisputed victories will have a specific reaction to the first real failure. We will see what Drethkai is made of. The 4th cycle fired. The quantum interference entered its 8th minute, and then, at 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the Krathvor communication systems regained partial coherence, and the first coordinated transmission that came from the flagship was not an attack order. It was a request for a direct, open channel with the commander of the human station. Park looked at Vasquez with an expression that contained at least 3 simultaneous questions. Vasquez responded with a single nod that meant, "Open the channel." Drethkai's voice came through the translation system with the vibrational texture of a being accustomed to being obeyed, but with something underneath, something the translator categorized as real-time assessment recalibration, which humans would likely call a combination of controlled anger and involuntary respect. Human commander, you attacked with weaponry not listed in any military capability catalog of your species. Vasquez replied in the tone of someone making a factual observation. Our catalog is more extensive than you imagined. A 4-second pause. What do you intend to achieve with this? Our fleet remains 94% intact. This station would not survive a coordinated offensive. Probably not, said Vasquez. But that coordinated offensive would cost you more than anything you've encountered in the last 12,000 years. And the next one you faced would cost even more. And the one after that. She let the silence work for 2 seconds. You assessed humanity as an early space-age species. You evaluated the numbers, the surface technology, the geopolitical distribution. You correctly calculated that we have no way to defeat a fleet of 500 ships in conventional terms. A deliberate pause. What you did not calculate is what happens when a species that has spent 10,000 years finding creative solutions to problems it shouldn't be able to solve decides this is just another problem to solve. Another silence, longer this time. You are suggesting negotiation, said Drethkai. I am suggesting that the calculation that brought you here was incomplete, said Vasquez, and that completing that calculation before making your next decision is in everyone's interest, including yours. The channel remained open. No one on the bridge audibly breathed for a long moment. Then Drethkai spoke again, and what he said was something the translation system processed for 3 full seconds before converting, because the semantic structure had no direct equivalent in any cataloged human language. The closest version the system could produce was, "You have the Supremacy's attention, human commander. Use it wisely." Elena Vasquez looked at the 523 dots on the holo display, which now, for the first time since they had appeared, were not moving towards Helix 9, and said with a tranquility that cost her everything she had, "With pleasure." The negotiation took 11 hours. It was the kind that happened between parties who had hurt each other in ways not entirely foreseen, each word carrying the weight of everything established in the preceding hours, the kind that humans had practiced more frequently than any other species in the galaxy, for reasons that xenopolitical historians would spend decades debating. Drethkai was not stupid. What he was, Vasquez realized in the first 2 hours, was inflexible within his models and absolutely adaptable when forced to recognize that a model had failed. A commander capable of learning recognized when data demanded a revision of premise, even if painful. Ambassador Theros stood beside Vasquez throughout the negotiation. Vasquez had deliberately requested his presence as a witness. Whatever was agreed upon needed to be seen by a species that carried in its own history the scar of 14 lost colonies. Theros' presence was a living reminder that there were real consequences to the 2 available paths, and that the path chosen now was not just about Helix 9. It was about what kind of galaxy everyone would inhabit from then on. The breaking point came in the 7th hour. Drethkai presented what he clearly considered a generous concession. Humanity would maintain existing stations, cease all expansion for 50 years, and pay symbolic tribute in minerals, less real economic value than hierarchy establishing value. Vasquez listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for 12 seconds. Admiral Drethkai, you are proposing a solution to the problem you diagnosed, not to the real problem. What you diagnosed. An emergent species expanded into a strategic corridor without authorization. Obvious solution, restriction, and hierarchy. She placed her hands on the table. The real problem is that humanity doesn't stop. It's not politics, it's not ideological choice. It's what we are. In 50 years, there will be new stations, new routes. And the next time the Supremacy sends a fleet, it will encounter a humanity that has spent 50 years with exactly one objective, not to be surprised in this way again. The agreement you propose doesn't buy peace. It buys 50 years of preparation for a harder war. What do you propose? Mutual recognition. The Supremacy recognizes humanity as a legitimate expanding species in already explored regions. Humanity recognizes the supremacy's historical strategic corridors and does not establish a presence in them without prior negotiation. We create a permanent mechanism for territory disputes and a non-aggression treaty with review every 25 years. A pause. It's not hierarchy, it's architecture. Hierarchy requires maintenance by force. Architecture works on its own because everyone has an incentive for it to work. Dreth Kai took 8 minutes. When he responded, the tone had changed. Parity assessment instead of concession to an inferior. The proposal has structural merit. There are details that will require negotiators with greater authority. And greater than mine, Vasquez agreed. But the principle can be agreed upon now as a basis for formal negotiations. You negotiate with the practice of someone who has done this many times. My species has done this many times. We are perhaps the most experienced negotiating species that exists, for reasons that probably don't make us proud in retrospect. And then something happened that Theros would later describe as the most unexpected event I have witnessed in 32 years. Supreme Admiral Dreth Kai emitted a vocalization that the system took 4 full seconds to classify and converted, with the caveat that the equivalence was approximate, as humor, the kind that recognizes genuine irony. It was the first documented time a Krathvor admiral had laughed during a negotiation. The agreement in principle was signed at 02:17 on the 4th day. Short, direct, with deliberate room for interpretation at the margins. Specificity creates sharp edges. Margins create room for adaptation. When the fleet began repositioning for the jump point, Dreth Kai transmitted a final message, without the markers of superiority that had colored all previous communications. The Supremacy's formal negotiators will make contact in 90 days. Keep the channel open, human commander. The channel remains open, Admiral. When the last ship disappeared into the jump point, and the holo display once again showed only mustard and the empty star field, the bridge fell into genuine silence. Not of people containing reactions, but of people who needed an instant to understand where they were now compared to where they had been before. It was Okafor who broke the silence, with the curiosity that was his most consistent characteristic. What do you think will be in Dreth Kai's report to the Supremacy? That the emergent species assessment model needs to be revised. That classification by surface technology is inadequate for civilizations with an extensive history of internal conflict. That humanity represents a new category that the Supremacy has no framework to process. Is that good or bad for us? It's real. Real is always better than convenient for the other side. Volkov, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, said, Beatrice Salazar will want to know how it went. I promised I'd tell her. That comment was what finally broke the 96-hour tension. Someone laughed. Then someone else. Not the hysterical laughter of relief, the laughter of people who remembered suddenly and with full force that entire lives existed outside that epic moment. That there was a cook waiting for news, that coffee was running out, that someone needed to sleep 2 days ago, that the universe sometimes required a station of 382 people to modify orbital cleaning systems and reprogram transmitters and rely on the wisdom of a silicon being to avoid a galactic war. And that somehow it had worked. Grek emitted a long pulse that the translator took 6 seconds to convert. The Kreth have an expression for this moment. Approximate translation, the day the improbable became precedent. Vasquez looked at the ancient being who had guarded a fragment of knowledge until its specific utility arrived, and had delivered it to a team of short-lived beings who had never needed to know that frequency existed. Thank you, Grek, for everything. The Kreth remained motionless. Then, it was interesting. In the archives of the Galactic Council, the Elder Archivist added a new entry that night. First documented interaction between the Krathvor Supremacy and the Humanist species. Result: treaty in principle. Observations: The warning of the ancients remains valid, not for the reason contemporaries assumed. Humanity is not dangerous because it is violent. It is dangerous because it is creative, adaptive, and fundamentally incapable of accepting that a problem has no solution. Recommendation for species encountering humans. Do not underestimate them. Secondary recommendation. Consider having them as allies. The cost is considerable in patience and unpredictability. The potential benefit is unparalleled in the known galaxy. The archivist read what he had written once. Then he added the final line, the most accurate thing to say. Never underestimate a species that survived itself. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. Because the universe is vast, the challenges are immense, and humanity still has many frontiers to cross. The next story is already being written on the edges of explored space. Don't miss it.